Then one day I was walking down this road and I heard the Beatles for the first time, and it was like, wow.
Before death came knocking unexpectedly, Ozzy Osbourne managed to whisper to posterity a strange list. Not a last will, nor a final manifesto. It was a secret catalogue of legends. 7 names, 7 voices. He considered the light. At the end of the tunnel, immortal icons who guided him pulled him from darkness and transformed a failed misfit into a legendary symbol. Don't be fooled by appearances. Ozzy Osbourne may look like an eccentric rock player or the madman who ignited the heavy metal movement with a single chaotic scream. But deep down, Ozzy is someone who worships music like a religion, speaking of the artists he loves, with the reverence people usually reserve for saints or legendary athletes. In the list, Ozzy called them the 7 souls who keep the flame. 7 artists whose voices, if the world were to collapse, would still echo through the universe like an eternal curse. But who are they? Why would a heavy, rebellious, bizarre rocker like Ozzy revere them so much? Did they ever meet? Ever perform together? Or are they merely metaphysical connections between broken artistic souls? Dive into the details of Ozzy's 7 favorite singers in the video below. Number 7, the Beatles. Born in poverty and raised in the bleak grey streets of post-war Birmingham, Ozzy could have easily been swallowed by darkness like thousands of other kids sinking into crime addiction or withering away in cold, lifeless factories. But then he heard the Beatles. Their songs weren't just melodies, they were an invitation, a secret door leading out of the rusting factories and crushed dreams of his world. This wasn't some casual liking or distant respect. Ozzy's love for the Beatles bordered on religious devotion, embedded in his bloodstream from the time he was a poor kid in Aston, Birmingham, clutching his radio like a sacred relic, waiting for every note from that divine band to ring out. I was walking down Whitton Road, listening to She Loves You on a green radio, and boom, the world exploded from black and white into color. Ozzy recalled it like the moment the universe burst into life within his heart. From that moment, the Beatles were more than just a band to Ozzy. They were his reason to exist, a miracle that saved him from a life soaked in violence, poverty, and despair. While other kids dreamed of becoming footballers or mechanics, Ozzy chose the Beatles and never looked back. I didn't understand music theory, couldn't play an instrument. But when the Beatles sang, I just knew I had to do something with music, he said, eyes blazing like fire. Among the 4, John Lennon was the soul Ozzy clung to. Lennon was the rebel, the one who dared to say what no one else would. And that's what Ozzy worshipped. It's no coincidence he covered Working Class Hero with a trembling voice, as though lighting incense for a fallen saint. John was the only one who understood pain, suffering. Listening to him, I didn't feel alone anymore, Ozzy once shared, unable to hide his emotion. And if Imagine was Lennon's hymn, then Ozzy's Dreamer was the cracked mirror reflection from another wounded but hopeful soul. But Ozzy's love wasn't limited to Lennon's music. It extended to the man himself. His raw honesty, his admitted flaws, his unguarded vulnerability. I loved his truth, Ozzy said. He didn't pretend to be anyone else. He wrote about the ugly things he'd been through, and that made me see myself in him. For a poor lost boy in Aston, that naked truth was a miracle. Still, if Lennon was the heart, then Paul McCartney was the light. When Ozzy first met Paul in the early 2000s, he stammered, Like a fanboy meeting his God, I felt like I was seeing Jesus. That wasn't exaggeration. It was the raw truth from a man who'd once survived on Paul's melodies. Even when Ozzy asked Paul to play bass on one of his albums, and Paul politely declined, saying he didn't want to mess up a perfect mix, Ozzy still called it the greatest honor of my life. What overwhelmed Ozzy wasn't just Paul's fame, it was his boundless talent. He can do everything. Ozzy shook his head in disbelief. He writes eternal melodies. Who else can do that? Who else has stayed that great for so long? In the way Ozzy spoke of McCartney, there was a childlike awe, a pure admiration that never faded with time. And that's when you realize, behind the bizarre rock legend, behind the frenzied concert and infamous scandals, Ozzy Osbourne is just a kid who loves music. A dreamer once set aflame by Lennon and McCartney, and who never let that flame die. And it didn't stop there. Ozzy's love extended even to the often overlooked members. Ringo Starr, the cheerful drummer of the Beatles, once invited Ozzy to sing backing vocals on his solo album, Vertical Man. Ozzy accepted without hesitation. Not for prestige, but because it felt like touching a piece of his childhood. As for George Harrison, Ozzy expressed deep respect, calling him the quiet one who shook the world with every chord. What made Ozzy's love for the Beatles so special was their purity. I don't love them because they're legends. I love them because they make me feel alive, Ozzy once declared, and for a man who stood on the edge of life and death countless times, those words carry devastating weight. Songs like Yesterday, A Day in the Life, or Hey Jude weren't just music. They were soul-awakening bells for Ozzy. In an interview, he confessed he once broke down in tears while listening to In My Life during a battle with addiction. I saw my childhood again, my mother, our old home. The Beatles weren't just music, they were memory, he said, voice trembling. Today, after decades, at the peak of the metal wave, after biting off bat heads on stage and screaming before tens of thousands when it comes to the Beatles, Ozzy still transforms into a wide-eyed, grateful child. A man who once stared death in the face and survived thanks to 4 boys from Liverpool. Number 6. Led Zeppelin. Ozzy Osbourne has never hidden it. If Black Sabbath was the embodiment of primal darkness, then Led Zeppelin was the divine fire that burned into his mind from the very first listen. This wasn't ordinary admiration. It was an explosion. The kind of love that makes you want to shatter every boundary. When I heard Good Times, Bad Times, I thought I had just witnessed God's wrath. Ozzy recalled his eyes flashing with the memory. It wasn't music anymore, it was magic. From that moment on, Zeppelin became the model of boldness Ozzy always craved. Every time Jimmy Page slid his fingers across the strings, every time Robert Plant howled like he was summoning ancient gods, Ozzy's blood boiled. I didn't learn from them, he said. I was haunted by them. With Robert Plant, it wasn't just admiration, it was enchantment. Ozzy tried mimicking Plant's signature screams so many times he eventually lost his voice. That guy screamed like he was possessed. And I wanted to scream louder, he laughed defiantly. It was inspiration competition, a musical challenge from a fellow warrior of the time, John Bonham. Now that was a different story. Not just someone Ozzy admired, Bonham was a drinking buddy, a partner in crime, a comrade in nights of glorious chaos. I once downed an entire crate of beer with him and climbed onto a hotel roof to scream, "Stairway to Heaven." At 3 a.m., Ozzy recalled, half laughing, half nostalgic. Nobody dared stop us, because that was Bonzo. And in that madness, there was a friendship forged in fire. Jimmy Page was like a sorcerer, quiet, cold, but conjuring sounds from the abyss. Ozzy once sat silently in a studio with him not daring to cough. He doesn't play guitar. He summons something from another world, Ozzy said. "I've never seen anyone command the air with sound like that." Led Zeppelin didn't just inspire, they applied pressure. We knew they were smashing every mold, and we wanted to break even more. Ozzy said, "Zeppelin was the call. We were the answer. They were the reason Sabbath dared to make Paranoid, dared to bring nightmares onto the radio." But perhaps the most profound moment came with Bonham's death. "I didn't just lose a friend. I lost a piece of rock," Ozzy said solemnly. At a show, shortly after he left the drum kit in the center of the stage, empty a spotlight, casting onto the cold void. No words were needed. The audience understood. Years later, during a secret jam in London, Ozzy saw Plant again. He stood at the edge of the stage, silent eyes welling up as that voice rang out once more. "I felt like a kid, discovering rock for the first time, and he was still that undying flame." To this day, when someone asks Ozzy about Zeppelin, he doesn't just recount stories, he ignites. As if their presence wasn't just a chapter in music history, but destiny. A destiny that made a poor boy from Aston dare to dream, dare to scream, and in the end, dare to carve his name into legend. Number 5. Elton John.
I don't like fame anymore. I was comfortable with it when I was younger, and I would go to the opening of Wallets, and it's different when you're young. I'm 57 now.
Next is Elton John, a musical monument who is not only Ozzy Osbourne's idol, but also a true friend. To Ozzy, Elton wasn't just a great artist. He was the embodiment of courage, complexity, and burning passion. Both of them were larger than life. Souls that once blazed on stage, bathed in glory and destruction, but never let the spotlight dim. What mattered most, the music. Elton is a bloody genius, Ozzy once said, not to flatter, but like stating a law of physics. He's got an amazing voice, and he writes songs that hit the bottom of your heart. You hear them once, and they stay with you forever. When the two collaborated on Ordinary Man, the gut-wrenching ballad from the album of the same name, it wasn't just a spontaneous duet. It was Ozzy's dream come true, a handshake between two icons who had both touched the bottom of life. "I couldn't believe it when he said yes," Ozzy recalled, still struggling to grasp the reality. "We were in the studio, and he started playing piano. I just sat there, completely frozen, thinking, is this real? And from that strange moment, something sacred was born. Ordinary Man wasn't just a song. It was a confession, a soul bearing from two survivors. One had battled addiction, the other had stared down death. They didn't need to perform. They sang with every open wound, and that raw truth bled through every note. Elton's been through so much, just like I have Ozzy said, his voice heavy. You can hear it in his singing. That depth, that truth you can't fake. That's what makes him special. There were no stage lights there, just two scarred men finding each other in music, like finding a mirror that finally reflected their own pain. What many don't know, Elton was one of the few who stayed in regular contact with Ozzy during his health crisis in 2019. While many friends in the music world went silent or distant, Elton called, checked in, even visited. To Ozzy, that wasn't just friendship, it was life itself. He's not the kind of guy who shows up for the cameras. Elton came when I needed him. No one else did, he said in an interview. Their bond wasn't rooted in fame, but in pain. Both had tasted drugs, alcohol, depression, even suicidal thoughts. But they emerged, not by hiding their scars, but by turning them into songs. When you hear Elton sing, you know he's cried in the dark, Ozzy said. That voice, no one can fake that. Ozzy's fans were devastated when Ordinary Man was released. Not just because of its heartbreaking melody, but because of its ominous farewell lyrics. I don't want to die an ordinary man. The line rang out like a dying wish. Elton didn't just duet. He sang as if bidding farewell to a friend. Some fans admitted they cried. Others called it Ozzy's early goodbye. To Elton, Ozzy was one of the most respected artists he'd ever known. In his tribute after Ozzy's passing, Elton called him one of the greatest and most genuine friends I ever had. He didn't emphasize the fame or the legend. He emphasized the word genuine. That's something only those who've walked through storms can recognize in each other. And to Ozzy, Elton John was always an anchor in the chaos. Not just the artist, he once idolized Elton, was living proof you can hit rock bottom and still sing again. Still walk on stage with eyes once dried of tears and silence the world. Number 4, Artha Franklin. Ozzy Osbourne once shared that he would go completely silent amidst old recordings, overwhelmed with emotion, as the voice of Artha Franklin poured out of the speakers. Artha, the queen of soul of faith and of those howls echoing from the deepest corners of the soul. In a rare interview, Ozzy said she sang like she was tearing out her soul and handing it to someone else. Imagine this, a man who once bit the head off a bat on stage, who screamed amidst fire and darkness, reduced to tears while listening to Aretha's A Natural Woman. That's no joke. Ozzy once recalled hearing Artha for the first time in the late 60s, just a scruffy lad from Birmingham, and being utterly haunted by a voice that went beyond reason. No one would expect a heavy metal rocker to worship a gospel diva. But Ozzy was different. He never hid it. I grew up on blues, on soul, and Artha was my first high priest, Ozzy admitted. Her voice wasn't just beautiful, it was an emotional tsunami. Every time she sang, he felt himself being yanked from the darkness and hurled into a blinding space of faith. What made Ozzy especially obsessed with Artha wasn't just her tone, it was the bravery in her voice. She didn't sing to show off, he said. She sang to survive, to fight, to save, and to someone who had drowned in drugs and cheated death more than 3 times like Ozzy, that meant nothing short of a miracle. Strangely enough, Ozzy once said that if he could choose any female voice to drop into a Black Sabbath track, it would be Aretha's. Imagine her doing the chorus of Changes or Planet Caravan. Ozzy laughed, eyes lighting up like a kid who just dreamt up some mad sorcery. In a list he once made of the greatest female voices, Ozzy named Artha as one of only 2 women he truly revered alongside Tina Turner. But he made it clear, Tina is fire. Artha is the thunderstorm from heaven. She didn't need to move. She didn't need flashy costumes. Just to open her mouth, and every broken soul would shatter. Maybe they never met. Maybe Artha never knew that a metal legend once trembled at the sound of her voice. But that didn't matter, Because, as Ozzy said, she didn't sing to be worshipped. She sang because if she didn't, the earth would explode from pain. Number 3, Steve Marriott. But legendary names like Lennon-McCartney or Elton John weren't the only ones Ozzy revered. Sometimes his admiration was reserved for names long forgotten or never widely known. Case in point, Steve Marriott, the thunderous voice behind Small Faces and Humble Pie. In 1972 at the Akron Rubber Bowl Stadium, Ozzy and Black Sabbath headed backstage as usual for a gig. But the whole script got flipped when Marriott appeared. No pyrotechnics, no rituals, just one note, and the entire arena felt like it was being incinerated in fire and soul. Ozzy, who always prided himself on his stage presence, lay still, in the wing's mouth agape, convinced Steve was lip-syncing. I looked for a Revox machine. I couldn't believe that sound was real, Ozzy later recounted. But it was. Marriott didn't need effects, didn't need tricks. He was the microphone. He screamed, he howled, he spat every syllable like he was ripping out his own throat to spray blood on the crowd. And that was the moment Ozzy knew he'd just encountered someone beyond logic. Marriott didn't just sing. He lived inside each lyric. He didn't fake madness. He was madness. A soul torn open by blues and soul inside the body of a British rock lunatic. What drove Ozzy mad with awe wasn't technique. It was the emotional hurricane Marriott hurled at the audience like he was punching them with a heart that had just shattered. Marriott's voice to Ozzy was a pure emotional weapon. It was so powerful, so raw. I'd just listen and think, how the hell does he do that? In the years that followed, Ozzy kept mentioning Marriott as a living icon. I've seen plenty of screamers, plenty of guys forcing blood out of their throats. Ozzy said, but Steve, he just opened his mouth and you felt like a demon had been baptized in blues. The memories of touring with Humble Pie burned bright in Ozzy like a reel of blazing film. I watched him on stage and thought, he must be miming. No way this is real. But it was. It was really him, a stage monster. Marriott's voice could soften a warhead or shatter an angel's heart from sheer envy. And that's why, in every greatest singer list Ozzy ever made, Steve Marriott was always there. No debates, no PR hype, just a name that, whenever Ozzy said it, his voice would drop, as if summoning the spirit of someone who had once saved his soul through pain and song. Maybe you've never heard of Steve Marriott. Maybe you don't know who he is. But believe Ozzy Osbourne, a man who's seen every real and fake face in rock and roll, when he says Steve Marriott is the voice that made me shiver like God and the devil were singing through the same body. And if you still doubt, go play I Don't Need No Doctor by Humble Pie, and you'll understand why Ozzy, the bat-biter, once fell to his knees in reverence. Number 2, Little Richard, the first person who ever made Ozzy Osbourne tremble with joy, the first who made him realize that music could set the soul on fire, was none other than Little Richard, the holy madman of rock and roll. In an interview, Ozzy once whispered, like confessing a beautiful sin, "The first time I heard Little Richard, I thought I was possessed." At that time, young John Michael Osbourne was just 11 years old, living in a dark, working-class neighborhood in Birmingham. A tiny room, cracked lime walls, and a rickety old radio. Suddenly came that piercing scream, a wop-bop-a-loo, bop-a-lop-bam, boom. Ozzy's entire world exploded. I'd never heard anything that wild, that alive. I felt like I'd been kidnapped by some supernatural force. That wasn't music. It was a summoning straight from the devil, disguised in red lipstick and a heavenly bouffant. Little Richard didn't sing. He howled as if he were battling God himself. He didn't play the piano with his fingers, but with fire. And Ozzy the bullied, broke school-skipping kid understood for the first time that there was another world out there, one where you didn't need permission to be mad to live the way you wanted. I loved him like I loved my own father, Ozzy confessed, his eyes sparkling like a kid remembering their first superhero. He was the king and the queen of rock and roll. A joke? No. A gospel truth. To Ozzy, Richard wasn't a singer, he was a prophet leading lost kids out of the hell of ordinary life. Watching Little Richard perform was like facing a tornado, and Ozzy, instead of running, opened his soul wide to let it in. He didn't care what people thought. He just stepped out, did what he wanted, and you couldn't take your eyes off him. The swagger, the drama, the sense that anything could happen at any moment, it all seeped into Ozzy's performances later on. They never had a close personal relationship, never toured together, never recorded a song. But what Ozzy felt for Little Richard ran deeper than friendship. It was devotion, silent, enduring, sacred. At one awards show, Ozzy once spotted Little Richard from afar and couldn't bring himself to walk over. "I was afraid I'd cry," he admitted. "I was looking at a star I'd been chasing my whole life." Little Richard lit the torch, and Ozzy was the one who carried it into the night. Did you know, even the way Ozzy snarls, the way he screams, then cackles like a demon, the way he plays with the crowd through that sinful, seductive glare, all bear the imprint of Little Richard. It wasn't imitation, it was the inheritance of a flame that never goes out. Number 1, Bon Scott.
Even though we started the whole thing over here, like we played here before the Sex Pistols were even sort of, thought of.
Yeah.
In the golden age of rock, an era of endless benders, marathon tours, and blistering blood and fire performances, 2 names roared like thunder across the night: Ozzy Osbourne, the eerie voice of Black Sabbath, and Bon Scott, the wild spirit of AC/DC. Between them wasn't just artistic admiration, it was a bond of blood, a brotherhood, forged in the roar of amplifiers and the stench of whiskey-soaked backstage chaos. Ozzy once said, without hesitation, "Bon Scott is the greatest frontman I've ever known." His voice was like a V8 engine screaming down a highway. No sweetness, no pretense, but it made my heart explode every time I heard "Highway to Hell." Not Brian Johnson, not any other name that came after. Bon Scott was the irreplaceable monument in Ozzy's heart. In the 70s, as Black Sabbath and AC/DC stormed across America, Ozzy and Bon would often cross paths backstage in bars, in studios, and even during their lowest, darkest moments. One source once recounted, Bon pulled Ozzy out of a bathroom when he was nearly passed out drunk, and Ozzy once used his own body to shield Bon when fans dragged him off stage. These seemingly trivial moments were the very glue that bonded them like blood brothers on the battlefield of rock and roll. When Bon Scott suddenly died in 1980 from choking on his own vomit, while drunk, frozen, stiff in a car in London, Ozzy was devastated, as if punched square in the face. He couldn't hide the emotion, and just a few months later, Suicide Solution was born. Though much debate surrounds whether the song was truly written for Bon, Ozzy confirmed in an interview that Bon's death was a wake-up call, and he wanted to warn people not to destroy themselves with alcohol like my brother did. Bon and Ozzy, they weren't just 2 voices. They were 2 wild beasts. in the jungle of rock, always snarling in their own ways, yet quietly watching and respecting each other. Bon was raw instinct, the cocky tilt of an untamable Aussie rocker. Ozzy was the darkness madness coursing through his veins. But in their contrast, they found each other, two perfect shards in a fractured, chaotic rock world. Once when asked if he could bring any deceased artist back on stage, Ozzy didn't even pause, Bon Scott. I want to hear that screech one more time, drink a shot of whiskey with him, and scream into the mic together. We had too many nights left unfinished. More than once on the stage, Ozzy has roared Bon's name before diving into blistering solos. Deep down, he knows Bon never truly died. Every guitar riff, every hoarse scream in the night is an unspoken requiem to his fallen soulmate. To Ozzy, Bon wasn't just the first lead singer of AC/DC. Bon was a living legend, the untamable spirit that still burns in the heart of the Prince of Darkness. And when one legend calls another brother, it's not a compliment. It's a blood oath, a covenant between two immortal souls. Before he died, Ozzy Osbourne still spoke of his favorite voices with raw emotion, as if reliving his very first concert. Each of them left a mark on Ozzy's heart as brothers, as friends, and sometimes as scars that never quite healed. And what about you? Who do you love most among these names? Was Bon Scott the first voice that pulled you into the world of rock? Or was it another voice that gave you chills on a lonely night when the whole world turned its back on you? Drop a comment below. Tell us about those moments when music touched you, saved you, just as it once saved Ozzy. If you felt something hit, share this video and subscribe to our channel so you never miss another blood-pumping story like this one. Thank you for staying until the very end. And remember, as Ozzy once screamed into the darkness, you can't kill rock and roll. It's here to stay.